So, imagine for just a second that you're standing in your front yard.
Right.
It's, a quiet evening, the sun is just starting to dip behind the trees, and you are simply looking out over your property, just taking it all in.
Sounds nice.
Right. But now, imagine your neighbor from across the street is pacing back and forth on the public sidewalk right in front of your house.
Oh, weird.
Yeah, and they aren't just out for a casual stroll. They are walking deliberately, like placing their feet right on the absolute millimeter edge of where the public concrete meets your private grass.
Just back and forth.
Back and forth,
Yeah.
back and forth. And to make this scenario truly uncomfortable, they are holding a pair of heavy, high-powered military binoculars.
Oh, wow.
And they are staring directly into your living room window.
Yeah, that creates a pretty immediate visceral reaction, doesn't it? Like
Yeah.
the hairs on the back of your neck just stand up.
Exactly. You feel threatened, your heart rate spikes. So naturally, you walk out there and confront them. You ask them, what on earth they're doing. And your neighbor slowly lowers the binoculars and calmly says, I am standing on a public sidewalk. It is completely legal for me to walk here, and it is completely legal for me to look in whatever direction I choose.
Which is technically true.
Right. They say, I'm just exercising my freedom of movement. I'm doing absolutely nothing wrong. And technically, according to the strictest letter of the municipal code, they might be right.
But you, standing on your lawn, are experiencing something entirely different.
Exactly. You aren't thinking about the law. You're wondering, are they mapping out my house for a robbery? Are they just trying to intimidate me?
Or is this an aggressive provocation meant to, bait you into throwing the first punch?
Yes. And what you're describing is the exact psychological and legal friction point that defines the modern international order right now.
Because what happens between neighbors on a suburban sidewalk is, honestly, virtually identical to what happens between global superpowers on the world stage.
Just replace the binoculars with nuclear-powered attack submarines, right?
Right. Yeah. Submarines, advanced surveillance drones, hypersonic missiles. It's the same fundamental dynamic.
And that gets us right to the heart of our mission for this deep dive today. We are taking a massive, intensely complex stack of sources, ranging from the 2009 Australian Defence White Paper to incredibly dense maritime legal analyses.
Right, from places like the Utrecht Journal and the Heritage Foundation.
Exactly, all the way to military doctrine concerning Ukraine, Taiwan, and the psychological battlefields of cognitive warfare. We're taking all of this to answer one world-defining question.
Which is, when global powers move their military assets right up to the edge of another country's territory, is it a legal defense of sovereign rights, or is it a deliberate, calculated attempt to provoke a crisis?
Right, and to answer that, we really have to look at the fundamental architectural flaw in how the world operates today.
Yeah, we are going to explore how Western actors, specifically the United States, NATO, and allies like Australia, frame their forward-deployed military presence.
Because the Western framework defines these movements as defensive deterrence.
Right. The argument is that they are simply upholding a rules-based international order, keeping the global commons open for free trade, protecting allies.
But when you look through the lens of opposing actors, like specifically China and Russia, those exact same movements, those exact same aircraft carriers and missile deployments, they are viewed as existential threats.
Yeah, the opposing view doesn't see deterrence at all. It sees deliberate encirclement, coercion, and aggressive escalation designed to force a confrontation.
And I want to pause here for a second because we are dealing with live, highly charged global friction points today. Ukraine, Russia, Taiwan, the U.S., China.
It's a minefield.
It really is.
Yeah.
So we need to be absolutely clear with you, the listener, about our objective here. Our goal today isn't to play judge and jury.
No, not at all.
We are not picking sides. We are not here to label anyone the good guys or the bad guys. We are putting on our geopolitical X-ray glasses to look exclusively at the structural mechanics of why these nations are clashing.
We are just unpacking the frameworks, the contested laws, and the political science theories contained within the source material.
Exactly. So that you, listening to this, can understand the actual architecture behind the alarming headlines you see every single day.
Which is honestly the only way to genuinely understand global conflict. If you only look at international relations through the lens of one nation's righteousness, you are blind to the structural forces driving the system.
Right, you miss the bigger picture.
Yeah, we have to understand how a single action can be simultaneously rational and defensive to one state and aggressively provocative to another.
So to understand why the world feels like a powder keg right now, Our sources tell us we need to rewind the clock a bit.
We do. We have to look at how nations started fundamentally changing their defense postures well over a decade ago.
And the perfect starting point for this is the Australia Defense White Paper from 2009, the one titled Force 2030.
Yeah, the 2009 Australian White Paper is a remarkably candid document. It signals a massive pivot in Western strategic thinking.
Set the scene for us a bit. What was the global context leading up to 2009?
Well, think about it. For years, following the September 11 attacks, Western militaries, including Australia, which was a major contributor to operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, they were heavily focused on intrastate conflict.
Right, the whole defense apparatus was geared toward counterinsurgency, stabilization operations, hunting terrorist networks.
Exactly, dealing with non-state actors.
They were built for fighting essentially asymmetric wars, right? Light infantry, armored personnel carriers, drone strikes in the desert. They were basically putting out brush fires inside other people's countries.
Yes, exactly. But the 2009 White Paper marks a structural realization that that era was ending.
What changed?
Australia looked at the broader global environment, specifically the rapid economic and military rise of China and the corresponding relative decline of the U.S. unipolar moment.
That brief period after the Cold War where American hegemony was essentially unchallenged.
Right. Australia realized that the future of conflict wasn't going to be hunting insurgents in landlocked mountains. It was returning to high-intensity interstate conflict.
Powerful nations facing off against other powerful nations.
Yes.
So when a country has that kind of realization, how does it physically manifest? Like, what do you actually buy when you decide the next war is going to be against a peer adversary instead of a terrorist group?
Well, you completely retool your military procurement. The White Paper explicitly details a massive long-term investment in a heavy, high-tech maritime force.
So ships and subs instead of Humvees.
Yes. Australia committed to replacing and significantly expanding its submarine fleet, heavily prioritizing anti-submarine warfare, or ASW capabilities, and purchasing advanced offshore combatants.
And what was the stated goal of all this new hardware?
The driving military strategy laid out in the paper was the imperative to, quote, control the air and sea approaches to Australia.
Okay, let's unpack this. So they realized that to defend an island continent, you can't just wait on the beach with a rifle.
No, definitely not.
You have to secure the vast oceanic neighborhood around you. You have to deny an adversary the ability to even park their ships near your coast.
Precisely. They were engaging in what defense strategists call strategic hedging.
Strategic hedging, okay.
Yeah, they weren't saying war was inevitable, but they were building a robust foundation to manage strategic risk in a rapidly changing, increasingly uncertain Asia-Pacific region.
They wanted the capability to project lethal force outward into the maritime approaches to keep any potential threat at arm's length.
Exactly.
It sounds like Australia stopped worrying about putting out fires in the neighbor's house and started focusing entirely on digging a massive high-tech moat around their own property, just filling it with attack submarines and anti-ship missiles.
That's a great analogy, actually.
But look at this from the outside. If I am Australia, I view my new high-tech moat as a purely defensive measure, right? I just want to be safe in my own home.
Right.
But if I am a growing power in that same region, say China or even Indonesia, and I see Australia rapidly arming itself with advanced, long-range maritime strike capabilities, I don't care what the white paper calls it, I feel inherently threatened.
And there we have the foundational concept of modern international friction, the security dilemma.
The security dilemma.
Yes. It was famously articulated by political scientist Robert Jervis. The tragedy of the security dilemma is that the actions a state takes to increase its own security inherently decrease the security of others.
Oh, that makes sense.
Think about the nature of a submarine. Australia might say, hey, we are buying these submarines purely to defend our coastline.
But a submarine is inherently an offensive stealth weapon.
Right. It is designed to sink other ships without warning. If you are a neighboring country, you have to plan based on the capability of that submarine, not the stated intent of the Australian government.
Because intent can change overnight with an election, but the submarine is still sitting off your coast.
Exactly. So what does the neighbor do? They feel insecure, so they build their own anti-submarine frigates to defend against your submarines.
And then Australia sees those frigates, feels insecure, and buys more advanced missiles.
Exactly. It is an action-reaction cycle where everyone is acting defensively, yet everyone ends up more heavily armed and closer to war.
Wow.
And where this gets incredibly dangerous in the modern era is that these defensive moats countries are building don't exist in isolation.
Right, the oceans aren't infinite.
No, they're not. These zones of control inevitably overlap, and where they overlap is where the legal and military friction is hottest, which is the exclusive economic zone.
The EEZ. If you follow global news at all, you see this acronym everywhere.
Oh, absolutely.
Because nations are pushing their maritime capabilities further out, they're constantly bumping into each other in these waters. And a huge portion of the sources we are analyzing today centers around the fact that the rules governing these waters are essentially a legal battlefield of their own.
To understand the friction, we have to look at the rule book, which is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLS.
UNCLS.
Yeah, this treaty was negotiated over decades, literally from the 1970s into the 1980s, to establish a comprehensive normative framework for the oceans.
Right.
Now, for our purposes, we don't need to get bogged down in the baseline measurements or the contiguous zones. We need to focus on the legal twilight zone, which is the exclusive economic zone.
Okay, let's define the boundaries of this twilight zone for the listener. It starts just outside a nation's territorial waters and extends out to 200 nautical miles from the coast.
Right.
200 miles is a massive chunk of ocean.
It is staggering when you map it out. When we
yeah.
combine the EEZs of every coastal nation on Earth, it encompasses roughly 40% of the world's oceans.
40%?
Yeah. Now, the critical distinction here, and the source of almost all modern maritime conflict, is that the coastal state does not have full sovereignty in its EEZ.
It is not their territory in the way the land is.
No. What they possess are sovereign rights specifically and exclusively for exploring and exploiting economic resources.
So if it's in the EEZ, it's your fish, your oil, your natural gas, your wind power, but you do not own the water itself.
Correct. The water column and the surface remain subject to specific international freedoms. Beyond the 200-mile limit, you hit the high seas, which belong to no one and are completely open.
Right.
But the EEZ is this hybrid space. It is economically owned by the coastal state, but navigationally open to the international community.
Which brings us to the ultimate friction point. I want to dive deep into a specific incident detailed in our sources that perfectly encapsulates why this legal ambiguity is so dangerous.
Let's do it.
Let's talk about March 2009 in the South China Sea, involving the USNS Impeccable.
This incident is a masterclass in how two global powers can look at the exact same patch of ocean, read the exact same treaty, and arrive at completely opposite, potentially lethal conclusions.
Okay, so let's set the scene. The Impeccable is a U.S. Navy ocean surveillance vessel. It is unarmed. Essentially, it looks like a large commercial ship, but it drags long arrays of sonar equipment behind it to map the seabed and, crucially, to track submarines.
Right.
In March 2009, it is operating about 75 nautical miles south of China's Hainan Island.
And Hainan Island is a highly sensitive location for China. It houses a major submarine base, specifically for their nuclear deterrent forces.
Right, so the Impeccable is well outside China's 12-mile sovereign territorial sea, but it is firmly inside their 200-mile EEZ.
Yes.
It's dragging its sonar arrays, doing its job. Suddenly, 5 Chinese vessels converge on it, and they don't just tail it from a distance, they swarm it.
The aggressiveness of the maneuver was shocking. You had Chinese naval intelligence ships, but also maritime law enforcement vessels and even coordinated fishing trawlers.
Wow.
They surrounded the U.S. ship, ordered it to leave immediately, and maneuvered in ways designed to physically impede its path. 2 of the Chinese ships closed to within 8 meters of the Impeccable.
8 meters. We are talking about massive steel ships on the open ocean. 8 meters is practically touching.
It really is.
A sudden swell or a slight miscalculation by the helmsman,
Right.
and you have a major collision. The Chinese crew even tried to snag the American ship's acoustic sonar array with grappling hooks.
Yeah, it was incredibly tense.
The Impeccable actually had to fire its fire hoses, its water cannons, to keep the Chinese ships away while making an emergency course alteration to avoid being rammed.
It was a highly coordinated effort to physically force a U.S. vessel out of the area, and the aftermath was an immediate diplomatic explosion.
I can imagine.
The Pentagon furiously protested, calling it illegal, aggressive harassment of a vessel operating lawfully in international waters. Beijing shot back with equal fury, stating the U.S. ship was operating illegally in their exclusive waters, threatening their national security, and ignoring repeated warnings to leave.
And the crazy part is, both the United States and China cited UNCLS to prove they were the ones following the law. How do two superpowers use the exact same treaty to justify almost ramming each other?
Because the treaty itself is fundamentally flawed in this specific area. Let's break down the competing legal architectures.
Okay.
The Western view, which the U.S. aggressively champions, relies heavily on UNCLS Article 58. This article explicitly states that in the EEZ, all states enjoy the freedoms of the high seas.
Which includes freedom of navigation?
Right, overflight and other internationally lawful uses of the sea related to the operation of ships.
So the U.S. argument is straightforward. They're saying, look, we are not fishing, we are not drilling for your oil. Therefore, we are not violating your economic rights.
Yes.
We are simply navigating and conducting military surveys, which are traditional freedoms of the high seas. We have every right to be here.
Exactly. They draw a hard line between economic activities which belong to the coastal state and military activities, which they argue are exempt from coastal state control.
But the opposing view, the Chinese view, relies on different parts of the treaty, right?
Yeah. Yes, specifically Article 56 and Article 301. Article 56 gives the coastal state jurisdiction over marine scientific research in the EEZ.
Ah, marine scientific research.
China argues that dragging advanced sonar arrays to map the ocean floor and track water temperatures is, by definition, marine scientific research. And under UNCLOS, marine scientific research requires the prior consent of the coastal state.
Consent that China certainly did not give.
Right. But the U.S. says, no, it's not scientific research, it's a military survey. We aren't doing science, we're looking for your submarines.
Which leads China straight to Article 301, I assume.
Exactly. Article 301 states that in exercising their rights, states must refrain from any threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state.
Okay, so China argues that sending a high-tech spy ship just outside their territorial waters, specifically to track their nuclear submarines and map the approaches to their sovereign naval bases, is inherently a non-peaceful act.
Yes. They view it as a direct threat to their security and an abuse of rights under the treaty.
It's incredible. The treaty basically says everyone has to operate with due regard for each other. The U.S. says, we have due regard, we aren't stealing your fish.
And China says, you have zero due regard, you are actively spying on our nuclear deterrent.
It feels like the lawyers who wrote this treaty deliberately left it vague because they couldn't agree.
That is exactly what happened. During the marathon negotiations for UNCLOS in the 70s and 80s, the maritime powers, the U.S., the Soviet Union, the UK, they demanded absolute military freedom in the EEZ.
And the developing coastal states.
They demanded restrictions on foreign militaries near their shores. They hit a deadlock. So, to get the treaty signed, they employed what diplomats call constructive ambiguity.
Constructive ambiguity.
Yeah, they used fuzzy terms like due regard and peaceful purposes, and simply left the conflict over military activities unresolved, just hoping future generations would figure it out.
And now that ambiguity is generating actual physical friction, because the U.S. doesn't just argue this in court. They argue it with destroyers.
Yes, they do.
They conduct what they call FMPs, freedom of navigation operations. They deliberately sail warships through these disputed areas to prove that they legally can.
Right. They argue that if they don't sail there, customary international law will eventually accept China's restrictions and the oceans will shrink.
That is the stated policy, yeah. The U.S. FMPs program has been running globally since 1979. Specifically designed to challenge what Washington deems excessive maritime claims by any nation, ally, or adversary.
Right.
So let me throw an analogy at you to capture how the other side views this. Imagine someone buys a massive military-grade tank.
Okay.
And technically, through some loophole in the local vehicle code, it is street legal. So the owner decides to drive this tank back and forth, constantly doing slow U-turns right in front of the local police station. Every single day.
Just to make a point.
Right. And every time the police come out and say, what are you doing? You are intimidating the town. You are tearing up the asphalt. The guy holds up the vehicle code and yells, read the rule book. I am legally allowed to operate this vehicle on a public road. I am just preserving my right to drive.
That's a very vivid picture.
At a certain point, you have to ask, are these OFNPs actually about upholding international law, or are they purely strategic signaling? Is the West intentionally provoking these countries to antagonize a response?
Well, if you analyze the situation through the strategic framework of our sources, you see two completely incompatible realities.
How so?
From the American vantage point, the fear of setting a bad legal precedent is genuine and existential. Remember the statistic, 40% of the oceans are EZs.
Right.
If the U.S. Navy suddenly has to ask permission to enter 40% of the world's navigable water, their ability to project power globally, to defend allies, or to secure trade routes is functionally crippled.
They view FONPs not as provocation, but as necessary maintenance of the global operating system.
Exactly. If you don't use the easement on your property, you eventually lose the legal right to it.
But step into the shoes of Chinese defense planners.
Right. They view this behavior, and they have stated this explicitly in international forums, as blatant navigation hegemony.
Hegemony.
To Beijing, FONPs have nothing to do with international law. They view them as a political theater of dominance. It is the United States running its gunboats through other people's backyards simply to prove they are still the global hegemon.
So China sees a U.S. destroyer doing circles off their coast and interprets it as a deliberate, calculated insult and a test of Chinese resolve.
Absolutely.
Now, it is incredibly easy to frame this entire dynamic as just a heavyweight boxing match between the United States and China. Two superpowers wrestling for control of the Pacific.
It is easy, but it's incomplete.
Right. Our sources make a vital point here. To truly understand this friction, we cannot just look at it through a Western or Chinese lens.
We have to examine how non-Western developing nations view this exact same legal architecture. We need to understand the perspective of the challenged state.
The challenged state. This is a critical expansion of the topic, because the narrative that this is purely a U.S.-China dispute is a dangerous oversimplification.
It really is. According to the maritime legal analyses provided in our sources, specifically the data from the Heritage Foundation, there are at least 27 countries globally that claim EEZ authorities going well beyond what the United States believes UNCLOS permits.
27 countries. So it's not just China trying to rewrite the rules.
No, and a significant portion of these are developing nations.
So why is that? Why do developing nations, countries in South America, Africa, or South Asia, want to lock down their EZs with the same intensity as a superpower like China?
Because for a developing nation, international law is often their only viable shield.
What do you mean?
Consider the power dynamic. A less developed coastal state does not have a blue water navy. They do not possess fleets of Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, nuclear submarines, or advanced maritime patrol aircraft to physically secure a 200-mile perimeter around their coast.
Right, they can't physically enforce it.
Exactly. If you cannot build a physical wall of steel and radar to keep a superpower's military away from your shores, your only recourse is to build a legal wall.
Ah.
You aggressively interpret the treaty to demand prior consent before any foreign warship can enter your zone, hoping the international community will respect the legal boundaries since you can't enforce a physical one.
That makes perfect sense.
Right.
They are using the bureaucracy of the UN as a substitute for naval firepower.
Yes.
Let's look at a concrete example of this from the sources, because this dynamic completely shifts how we understand global alliances. Let's contrast China's aggressive grappling hook response with how India handles the exact same situation.
India is perhaps the most illuminating case study we have for understanding the nuance of the challenged state.
How so?
Well, decades ago, in 1976, India passed domestic legislation that explicitly demands prior consent for any foreign military vessels conducting exercises or maneuvers within its exclusive economic zone.
So on paper, India's legal stance regarding military activities in its waters is remarkably similar, if not identical, to China's stance.
Yes.
And because the U.S. believes that claim is excessive, they don't respect India's law either.
Yeah.
Right? They run FONOPs against India just like they do against China.
That is correct. The U.S. Navy regularly conducts freedom of navigation operations inside India's EEZ.
Wow.
A prominent example occurred in April 2021 when the U.S. 7th Fleet deliberately sailed a guided missile destroyer through India's EEZ near the Lakshadweep Islands, explicitly stating the operation was to challenge India's excessive maritime claims requiring prior consent.
Okay, so the U.S. parks a heavily armed destroyer off the coast of India, openly violating Indian domestic law, just to prove a point. But here is the fascinating difference. When the U.S. does this to China, China sends 5 ships to swarm the Americans and nearly cause a collision. When the U.S. does it to India, India issues a polite diplomatic protest, but they don't send out the Indian Navy to ram the American destroyer.
No, they don't.
Why? If they both have the same law, why does India silently tolerate the provocation while China fights back?
The answer lies in the hierarchy of strategic interests. It is about strategic convergence versus strategic competition.
Okay, explain that.
Indian defense analysts and policymakers are on the record stating that they view U.S. FNOPs in their waters as illegitimate acts. They see them as unnecessary maneuvers meant solely to score geopolitical points, even if they are technically legal under Washington's specific interpretation of UNCLOs.
Right, it irritates New Delhi immensely.
But the Indian government chooses to absorb that irritation without escalating physically.
Because they are playing a longer game. They need the United States for something much more important than a legal dispute over a patch of water.
Exactly. India is actively building a deep, multifaceted strategic partnership with the United States, along with Japan and Australia in the Quad, specifically to counterbalance the rise of China in the broader Indo-Pacific.
So for India, the existential threat is an expansionist China pushing on their Himalayan land borders and encroaching into the Indian Ocean.
Right. A U.S. destroyer doing a legal U-turn off their coast is annoying, but it isn't an existential threat. India is willing to swallow its pride on the maritime law issue to maintain a united front against Beijing.
It's realpolitik at its finest. The enemy of my enemy gets to sail through my EEZ.
Very well put.
But the sources point out another massive difference between how India and China interact with international law, and I think it's crucial for understanding the challenge state mentality.
You are referring to their respective records on international arbitration.
Yes.
This is a fundamental divergence. India has demonstrated a willingness to submit to the international legal order, even when it hurts. Well, in 2014, India engaged in a UN-backed tribunal with neighboring Bangladesh over a disputed maritime boundary in the Bay of Bengal. The Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled overwhelmingly in favor of Bangladesh, awarding them roughly 12,000 square nautical miles of disputed EEZ territory.
India lost a massive chunk of maritime real estate.
And yet, the Indian government fully accepted the ruling and implemented it.
They took the loss to uphold the system. And what did China do when they faced a similar situation?
A completely opposite reaction. In 2016, the same Permanent Court of Arbitration issued a sweeping ruling in a case brought by the Philippines, invalidating almost all of China's expansive 9-line claims over the South China Sea.
And China?
Beijing completely rejected the ruling. They refused to participate in the arbitration, declared the verdict null and void, and essentially stated that international courts have no jurisdiction over what they consider their historical sovereign territory.
Which brings us to the most glaring, almost comical paradox of this entire deep dive.
The elephant in the room.
Yes. Regarding the United States' role as the enforcer of the rules-based order, we have spent all this time talking about the U.S. sailing warships into harm's way, risking international incidents to enforce the strict legal text of UNCLOS. But the United States has never actually ratified UNCLOS.
It is the ultimate geopolitical irony.
It really is.
The United States helped negotiate the treaty, but when it came time to sign it in 1982, President Reagan refused, primarily due to objections over deep seabed mining regulations.
Right.
Since then, successive U.S. administrations, both military and civilian, have argued that the navigational provisions of the treaty reflect customary international law, and the U.S. abides by them in practice. But the U.S. Senate has never mustered the votes to officially ratify the treaty.
So the global hall monitor, the guy handing out the detentions and writing the citations, isn't even officially enrolled in the school.
Pretty much.
Meanwhile, China, the country actively building militarized artificial islands, ignoring international tribunals, and trying to restrict freedom of navigation, is an official signatory. They ratified it in 1996.
It is the paradox of the compliant abstainer versus the non-compliant signatory. And it deeply undermines American credibility in the eyes of the global South.
I mean, put yourself in the shoes of a policymaker in a developing nation. You are watching the United States, a superpower that refuses to be legally bound by the treaty, using the banner of freedom of navigation to park multi-billion-dollar spy ships and carrier strike crews just outside the territorial waters of weaker nations.
Right.
Is it any wonder that these challenged states look at the Western concept of international maritime law and see it not as a neutral, fair set of rules, but as a weaponized tool of Western dominance?
No, it's not a wonder at all.
It looks exactly like a system engineered to allow the rich kids with the biggest toys to go wherever they want, while telling everyone else to sit quietly.
That perception is a massive liability for the West. When the law so perfectly aligns with the military advantages of a superpower, it is inherently viewed with suspicion by those who lack that power. They see the insistence on absolute freedom of navigation for military vessels as a mechanism designed to ensure that technologically superior states can project power right up to the coastline of any nation on Earth, leaving coastal states perpetually vulnerable.
And this endless naval posturing, these legal tugs of war over sonar arrays and EEZ boundaries. None of this is happening in a vacuum.
Definitely not.
It is not just an academic debate about fishing rights or mapping the seafloor. These maneuvers are actively setting the stage for existential geopolitical flashpoints. Which brings us to the most dangerous location on the planet right now, Taiwan.
The transition from the legal ambiguity of the EEZ to the strategic ambiguity of Taiwan is seamless because the underlying friction is identical.
Okay, let's look at the Duke University source analyzing U.S. security commitments to Taiwan. It provides a vital framework for understanding how military proximity, the ships we've been discussing, fundamentally alters the calculus of war and peace across the Taiwan Strait.
The core concept we need to unpack here is strategic ambiguity.
Right. It is a phrase that gets thrown around constantly in the news. Functionally, how does strategic ambiguity actually work in the relationship between the U.S., China, and Taiwan?
For over 40 years, since the passing of the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979, the United States has maintained this deliberate policy of strategic ambiguity.
What does that mean in practice?
In essence, the U.S. is legally obligated to provide Taiwan with defensive weapons so it can protect itself. However, the U.S. deliberately and explicitly refuses to state whether the American military would actually intervene and fight a war if China were to invade the island.
It sounds counterintuitive. Like, why wouldn't you just draw a red line and say, if you attack, we will fight? Why be vague?
Because the vagueness serves a mechanism of dual deterrence. It is designed to freeze the status quo.
Okay, walk me through that.
On one side, it deters Beijing from launching an invasion because Chinese planners have to factor in the very real possibility that the U.S. might intervene with overwhelming force, turning a regional conflict into World War III.
Right, they can't risk it.
Exactly. But on the other side, it deters Taiwan from taking provocative actions, like formally declaring independence, because leadership in Taipei knows that if they trigger a crisis, the U.S. might not come to save them.
So the entire piece of the region relies on both sides fearing the unknown.
Yes.
But the Duke analysis points out a fatal flaw that is emerging in this strategy. How does the physical proximity of all these military assets, the expanding Chinese Navy, the U.S. FNOPs, the carrier strike groups, how does that modernize and break this delicate balance of ambiguity?
The balance is breaking because the military realities on the ground, or rather on the water, have shifted dramatically over the last decade.
In what way?
As China has rapidly modernized its military, it has developed capabilities that simply did not exist during previous Taiwan Strait crises. They now possess anti-ship ballistic missiles specifically designed to sink U.S. aircraft carriers.
Wow.
They have a massive fleet of modern submarines. They possess the capability to strike U.S. bases in Guam and Japan.
So the cost of intervention for the United States has skyrocketed. It's no longer just about sending a carrier to show the flag. It's about risking American cities or bases in a major war.
Exactly. The Duke analysis highlights that as China grows more capable, Taiwan becomes increasingly, desperately reliant on the U.S. for its defense.
But simultaneously, because a war with China would now carry immense direct and bloody costs to the U.S. homeland and its forces, the U.S. commitment to actually defend Taiwan inherently becomes less credible in the eyes of Beijing.
Right. China might start to believe that Washington wouldn't actually risk Los Angeles or Guam to save Taipei.
It's a terrifying seesaw. Taiwan needs the U.S. more than ever, right at the exact historical moment when it becomes riskier than ever for the U.S. to actually step in. So how does the U.S. try to compensate for that loss of credibility?
By increasing the visible signals of their commitment, the U.S. feels the need to signal its support for Taiwan much more aggressively to maintain deterrence.
What does that look like?
This means more high-level political visits, more arms sales, and critically, more forward-deployed military assets.
Which brings us right back to the U-turns in front of the police station.
Exactly.
The U.S. sails a carrier strike group straight through the Taiwan Strait, or they fly advanced reconnaissance planes just along the median line.
Right, and the Western framework says, we are doing this to show support for democracy and provide defensive deterrence.
But China looks at those exact same ships and planes and views them as a direct, aggressive violation of their sovereign claims over Taiwan. They see it as the U.S. actively preparing for war.
Yes, they do.
I look at it like stretching a rubber band. The tighter the U.S. pulls that rubber band to show its strength and prove to China that deterrence is still real, the closer that rubber band gets to its snapping point.
That analogy perfectly captures the danger.
Every FONOP, every surveillance flight, every transit of the Taiwan Strait increases the physical friction.
And what we must realize is that this dynamic of physical friction, where defensive support is interpreted as aggressive escalation, is not confined to the maritime domain in Asia.
Right.
It is precisely what we are seeing mirrored with devastating kinetic consequences on land on the other side of the world.
That is the perfect pivot. Because the exact same psychological and strategic mechanics driving ships toward collision in the South China Sea are currently driving the land and air war in Eastern Europe.
Let's delve into the antagonise analysis of the Ukraine-Russia conflict.
Yes. The source provides a framework based on a hypothetical but deeply relevant scenario, a major Ukrainian offensive into Russian territory, backed heavily by advanced Western military technology, specifically systems like the British-French Storm Shadow cruise missile.
The antagonise paper is a phenomenal resource because it doesn't just look at the tactics of the war. It uses this scenario to contrast two foundational opposing theories of international relations.
Right. If you want a cheat code for understanding how geopolitical analysts map the world, it is understanding the debate between offensive realism and defensive realism.
Absolutely.
Let's break these theories down step by step because they are crucial. Let's start with offensive realism. The source points to the prominent scholar John Mearsheimer.
Yes, Mearsheimer.
If I am an offensive realist, how do I interpret NATO's expansion, the arming of Ukraine, and the delivery of these advanced missiles?
Well, offensive realism posits a very bleak view of the world. It argues that the international system is anarchic, meaning there is no global 911 you can call.
Right.
Therefore, great powers are inherently unavoidably driven to expand their power and influence. They can never be truly secure until they achieve regional hegemony, meaning they are the undisputed dominant power in their hemisphere.
So it's a zero-sum game of constant expansion.
Precisely. Under the offensive realist lens, NATO's actions expanding eastward over the decades and now heavily arming Ukraine with weapons like the Storm Shadow, which can strike deep behind Russian lines, are not viewed as altruistic acts to defend a young democracy.
Okay, so how are they viewed?
Instead, an offensive realist like Mearsheimer would argue that this is a deliberate, calculated strategy by the West to aggressively weaken a geopolitical rival.
Wow. In this view, Ukraine is essentially a tragic proxy.
Yes.
The West is using the conflict to test its latest military technology in a live environment, to bleed Russian military resources and the Russian economy dry, and to push Western dominance irreversibly into former Soviet spheres of influence.
That's the argument, yes.
The weapons deliveries aren't defense, they are an offensive chess move to trap and neutralize Russia.
Yes. Mearsheimer would argue that this is simply what great powers do. They constantly strive to maximize power at the expense of others. In this framework, the provision of these advanced missiles is an inherently aggressive act designed to systematically dismantle Russian regional power.
Before we move on, I want to clarify something for you, the listener. We are analyzing this through the cold, highly clinical lens of political science.
Yes, that's important to state.
We are setting aside the morality of the conflict, the human tragedy, and the illegality of the invasion. We are looking purely at state behavior as mechanics.
Right.
So if offensive realism sees NATO playing a ruthless game of geopolitical chess, constantly attacking to take pieces off the board, what is the alternative? How does defensive realism interpret the exact same events?
Defensive realism, which is championed by scholars like Robert Jervis, who we mentioned earlier regarding the security dilemma, and Stephen Walt, looks at state motivation differently.
Okay.
It argues that states are not primarily trying to maximize power or conquer the globe. Their primary overwhelming motivation is simply self-preservation. They just want to survive in an anarchic world.
But wait, if Russia's primary goal is just to survive, why on earth would they launch a massive invasion of a neighbor, escalate a brutal war, and repeatedly threaten the use of nuclear weapons?
It's a fair question.
That doesn't sound like a state just trying to peacefully survive.
It doesn't, until you view it through the agonizing logic of the security dilemma. Defensive realists like Stephen Walt point out that actions taken by one state to enhance its security, like NATO expanding to ensure European stability, or arming Ukraine to deter further aggression, often provoke intense existential insecurity in another state.
So when NATO pushes its borders eastward, or when it provides Ukraine with cutting-edge, long-range technology that can reach deep into Russian territory, NATO genuinely views those actions as defensive support.
Exactly.
But Russia views them as a tightening noose. They feel cornered, encircled by a technologically superior adversary, encroaching on what they consider their vital strategic buffer zone.
That's right.
Let me use an analogy here. Offensive realism sees NATO as a chess master, aggressively cornering the opponent's king.
True.
Defensive realism sees Russia not as an aggressive predator, but as a cornered bear.
That's a powerful image.
The bear isn't lashing out and destroying the campsite because it wants to conquer the forest. It is lashing out with terrifying violence because it feels the walls closing in, it feels trapped, and it believes it must fight ferociously just to survive.
That is exactly the distinction. Walt emphasizes that when great powers feel cornered and perceive their core survival is threatened, they are highly likely to take drastic, even seemingly irrational measures.
Okay.
The introduction of the Storm Shadow missile doesn't just give Ukraine a tactical advantage on the battlefield. According to defensive realism, it fundamentally alters the strategic balance, forcing Russia into a posture where they feel they must escalate the conflict, whether through mobilization, attacks on infrastructure, or nuclear rhetoric, simply to protect their sovereignty and signal that they cannot be pushed any further.
The technology itself exacerbates the tension.
It does.
If we accept this defensive realist framework, it leads to a very uncomfortable conclusion. If I know that you are a cornered bear, and I intentionally poke you with a longer, sharper stick, I know you are going to roar. I know you are going to swipe at me. In this framework, aren't Western weapon deliveries actually designed to be friction points? Isn't the West knowingly driving the escalation?
That is the tragic inevitability outlined by these theories, and it bridges our examples perfectly.
Yeah.
Whether it is an American surveillance drone flying just off the coast of Hainan Island, or a British-made Storm Shadow missile striking a Russian command post, advanced Western technology is utilized to signal dominance and enforce the rules.
And the opposing state, trapped in this spiraling security dilemma, interprets that signal as an existential threat and feels compelled to respond aggressively to show resolve.
Yes, it creates an escalation ladder where neither side feels they can afford to take a single step down because backing down means showing weakness, which invites further encroachment.
Which is terrifying, because taking step after step up that escalation ladder eventually leads to a direct kinetic war between nuclear powers.
It does.
But this brings us to the final and perhaps most mind-bending piece of the puzzle we have today.
Okay.
What if the ultimate goal of all these naval standoffs in the EZ, these FNOPs in the Taiwan Strait, these missile deployments in Eastern Europe, what if the goal isn't actually to start a physical war? What if shooting at each other is just the worst-case scenario failure, and the real war is already being fought right now, completely out of sight?
You are referring to cognitive warfare. And our final source, the analysis from the University of South Florida, maps out this invisible battleground with chilling precision.
Yeah, let's get into this.
This is where all the physical military movements we've discussed are weaponized for a different purpose entirely.
Let's define cognitive warfare, or CW. It sounds like a buzzword for propaganda, but the source makes it clear it is much more profound than that.
It is.
The source defines CW as the weaponization of information to alter how a target population thinks, acts, and makes decisions. The ultimate goal is to achieve your geopolitical objectives, to make the enemy surrender or comply without firing a single kinetic bullet.
Right.
How is that different from traditional propaganda?
The difference is scale, depth, and objective. Traditional propaganda tells you what to think. It tries to convince you that your side is good and the other side is bad.
Okay.
Cognitive warfare is vastly more insidious. It seeks to alter how a population actually processes reality itself.
Wow.
It takes the foundational elements of a free society like free speech, open media, democratic debate, and internet connectivity and weaponizes them. It twists those strengths into vulnerabilities, generating polarization, deep distrust of institutions, and internal chaos.
And the USF source provides incredible contrast between how the two primary adversaries of the West, Russia and China, approach this cognitive battlefield.
Yes, they do.
Let's break those approaches down because they are radically different. Start with Russia. How does the Kremlin fight a cognitive war? What is their mechanism?
Russia's approach is deeply rooted in historical Soviet intelligence concepts. specifically maskurovka, which translates to concealment or camouflage, and a very specific psychological mechanism called reflexive control.
Reflexive control.
Yes. The Russian approach to cognitive warfare is fundamentally destructive. Their goal is to generate friction, chaos, and societal paralysis within the target nation.
I want to linger on reflexive control because it sounds like science fiction. How do you functionally exert reflexive control over an entire country?
Reflexive control is the practice of feeding an adversary specifically tailored information, which can be true, false, or a mix of both, so that the adversary voluntarily makes the exact decision you wanted them to make, all while believing it was their own idea.
Wait, really?
Yes. You understand their biases, their fears, and their political divisions, and you manipulate the information environment so their natural reaction serves your strategic goals.
So it's not necessarily about convincing them you are right. It's about paralyzing them. The source quotes Peter Pomerantsev, the author who studies Russian media, describing the strategy as, when nothing is true, everything is possible.
Exactly. The Russian cognitive war doesn't necessarily aim to make an American or European citizen love Vladimir Putin. The goal is to flood the information environment with so many contradictory narratives, so many conspiracy theories, and so much manipulated outrage that the citizen simply gives up.
They conclude that no truth exists, that all politicians are corrupt, and that democracy is a sham.
Right. If a foreign power can make a target population doubt reality itself, they successfully paralyze the leadership. If the public doesn't know what's real, the government cannot muster the political will or the unified public support to act against Russian interests.
We saw the prototype for this in the Donbas region of Ukraine starting in 2014, didn't we?
We did, yes.
They blurred the lines entirely. Was it a local uprising? Was it Russian special forces? Were they fighting fascists? They mixed kinetic military support, the little green men, with a relentless barrage of contradictory disinformation, paralyzing the international community's response for years.
That's a perfect example.
So, if Russia's cognitive warfare is like throwing a smoke bomb into a crowded theater and shouting fire, just to watch everyone trample each other, how does China's approach differ?
China's approach is vastly different, reflecting their different strategic culture. According to the source, China aims for what analysts call a friendly embrace or constructive control.
Friendly embrace?
Yes, their strategy aligns closely with the ancient Sun Tzu principle of winning without fighting. It is persuasive and structural, not just destructive. They don't want to destroy the target society, they want to absorb its compliance.
How does a friendly embrace actually work in practice?
They seek to seamlessly integrate technological dominance, massive economic leverage, and relentless narrative control to shape the global environment. The goal is to arrange the pieces on the geopolitical board so that the target nation simply chooses to comply with China's goals because resistance appears either entirely futile or economically suicidal.
Oh.
They want to control the infrastructure of information like 5G networks, social media platforms, or global supply chains so they can subtly guide the narrative over decades. They want the target to believe that accommodating China's rise is just the natural, peaceful evolution of history.
So Russia wants to break your brain with chaos, and China wants to gently, systematically guide your brain into agreeing with them by controlling the environment you live in.
That's a good way to put it.
But here's the crucial synthesis. We have spent an hour talking about warships cutting each other off, submarines, and long-range missiles. How do those physical, heavy metal military maneuvers fit into a war of the mind?
This is where we tie the entire deep dive together. The kinetic actions and the cognitive warfare are not separate domains, they are perfectly integrated.
How so?
When a Chinese warship deliberately cuts across the bow of a U.S. destroyer at a distance of 8 meters in the South China Sea, or when Russia publicly warns that a NATO missile test will trigger World War III, or when the United States sails a massive aircraft carrier strike group right through the Taiwan Strait. These are not just military maneuvers.
What are they?
They are highly calculated cognitive operations.
It's all theater.
Yes.
The physical friction points the ships nearly crashing, the airspace violations, the missile test. They're actually just the visual aids for the cognitive war happening in our heads.
Precisely. They serve multiple cognitive functions simultaneously. For the domestic population of the country performing the maneuver, the imagery signals strength, resolve, and national pride. It keeps the population unified against an external threat.
And for the adversary.
But for the adversary's population, the maneuver is designed to induce fear and paralysis. When China rams a ship or surrounds Taiwan with warplanes, they are visually demonstrating a message to the American public. Are you really willing to send your sons and daughters to die over a tiny reef in the South China Sea? Is it worth it?
Wow.
When NATO tests advanced weapons, they are visually demonstrating to the Russian leadership, you cannot possibly win a technological arms race with us, so don't even try. The physical military asset, the ship, the plane, the missile, is just the heavy metal delivery mechanism for the psychological message.
That reframes everything. It changes how you read the news completely. You start realizing that every headline about a near miss in the sky, or a contested legal claim in the ocean, or a new weapons deployment is actually a targeted strike in a cognitive war. The ships aren't there to shoot, they're there to make you think. Let's summarize the immense journey we have been on today. We started by looking at Australia deciding to build a high-tech maritime moat. And we explored how the tragedy of the security dilemma ensures that defensive hedging inevitably creates fear in your neighbors.
Right.
We waded deep into the murky, intentionally ambiguous legal waters of the EEZ and NNCLS, discovering how two superpowers can quote the exact same treaty to justify almost colliding with each other.
We saw how developing nations, the challenged states, use international law as a shield, and how countries like India navigate the hypocrisy of superpowers to find strategic convergence.
We examined the lethal tightening tension of strategic ambiguity in Taiwan, and we applied the frameworks of offensive and defensive realism to understand the cornered bear dynamics driving the war in Ukraine.
And finally, we realized that the ultimate battlefield isn't the South China Sea or the plains of Eastern Europe. It is the human mind, where cognitive warfare turns multi-billion-dollar military maneuvers into psychological theater.
It is a profound shift in how we must understand power and conflict in the 21st century.
It is, but it leaves us with a critical, glaring vulnerability as we look toward the future.
Okay.
We have spent this entire deep dive analyzing how humans, human helmsmen on ships, human pilots in planes, and human leaders in capitals interpret these strategic signals. We've talked extensively about ambiguity, cognitive theater, and calculated posturing. Humans understand nuance. Humans understand bluffing.
Right.
But as both sides rapidly modernize, they are increasingly relying on unmanned aerial vehicles and autonomous AI drones to conduct these long-range patrols, to fly these FNOPs, and to test these borders. What happens when a machine is the one tasked with interpreting the maneuver?
Oh.
A machine algorithm does not understand strategic ambiguity. It does not grasp the nuance of cognitive theater. When an autonomous drone detects an adversary closing in at 8 meters, interpreting it solely as a vector and a velocity, does its programming decide to de-escalate, or does it instantly, logically trigger the very kinetic war that all of this posturing was meant to prevent?
That is a chilling thought to leave on. The idea that our highly calibrated, psychologically complex system of geopolitical signaling might be completely misunderstood by the very machines we are building to fight it. You, standing on your lawn, might understand your neighbor is just trying to intimidate you with those binoculars.
Yeah.
You know it's a bluff. But if you put an automated guard dog out there, it doesn't understand the bluff, it just bites.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of global friction. Keep asking questions. Always look past the headlines, and we will see you next time.